Welcome to Smart Architectural Programming. My name is Mohammed, and coding alongside me.
Is George. How's it going? And today, we'll be doing a simple roundup algorithm that we do plan to possibly put into a larger application. But we want to make sure that on this channel we kind of keep things very simple. Our aim here is not never to obfuscate, but to make sure things are very simple and straightforward. So that's what we're going to deliver today, hopefully. And Mohammed, I'll let you start breaking it down. And if you need to introduce anything about, the overall concept, feel free, Mohammed. You can take over.
So basically, again, we're going to be leveraging Flask, which is a lightweight Python web development framework. And like it's the best way and the most easiest way to focus on creating practical applications. And in this case, we'll be creating sort of an API, if you will, because we're going to leverage Flask, but we're not going to create HTML pages that render on a browser. We're just going to create a specific route within Flask that runs a specific logic, which would be a roundup logic, like you see in Acorns or other such trading platforms, where when individuals make purchases through their credit cards that um, cost us in something like 4.2 cent, $4.2 or $4.5 or $7.3. The difference between 7.3 to 8, 4.2 to 8, 4.5 to 8, that difference is automatically saved up in the Acorns or any other application that uses this features account that you can invest moving forward. So we're going to just try to replicate this simple feature using a simple Flask-based API endpoint. And uh, usually we use ChatGPT. You can leverage that to just get a simple framework, but we've already coded through this particular logic, and I'll just explain that. It's not very lengthy. It's not very complicated. So we'll just go over it and see if it works out basically. So I mean, this is a logic we coded up earlier and off screen, and like there's not much to it. Like it's 25 lines of code, and among that, uh, around you could say 6 or 7 lines are just the basic standard Flask lines that you need to implement for you to actually be able to run your Flask application. So we have we first import Flask Flask library, and then import the specific functions of Flask, request, and JSONify. Um, so then we create, we use the simple but standard syntax to initiate a Flask application, which is app equals to Flask. Basically here, here, this is the portion to do that, and then we go directly to create a app root. Now, an app root basically is just the URL for a specific portion of a website. If we are talking about website or browser-related development using Flask or any other web development framework. But in this case, the app root would be the API endpoint we'll be leveraging. And the important thing here is that we didn't define we excluded get from our methods, which means even if we try opening up the specific URL on a browser, that would not basically communicate back a response that we want. It basically it would not give us any response, because get get is the standard method through which you initially access pages, and that is not permitted under this root, and or probably in any other root that is created in particular to create an API. A method, if it's not allowed, means that it people cannot access that through the browser. So if you want to create an API endpoint using Flask or any other application, you need to limit the methods outside of post. Then we come back to the function that would run when this endpoint is called. So here we're using something called a try and except block, right? This is very important, in particular when you're dealing with information that comes outside of your code base. So try basically try basically what it does is that it makes sure to try and run a certain back end logic, right? If that logic doesn't run, usually if a certain logic does not run properly in a Python code, it would break up the application and you'll have errors running that code. But with the try block, it tries running that piece of that block of code here. If this code does not run as expected, or it has some syntax errors, or it has any other errors, it would abandon this instead of just stopping instead of stopping the Python code from running. It would move on to the except block where we defined an exception, which is just any error, and it would return a JSONify response. Now I'll come back to JSONify later when we are going and breaking down the code within the try block. So basically right now you just need to understand a try block attempts to run a piece of block of code. If that works, it works. If it doesn't, instead of the program exiting automatically, if as Python code does, if it doesn't work, it goes to the except block and runs the exception and just keeps on running the code below that instead of stopping the runtime procedure basically. So now moving back to this code again, try blocks are mostly used when you're dealing with data that's coming out of your code base. So here we're going to get a data from a request.json. Basically what this means is we're going to get a request in the JSON format. And unless we get a request in a JSON format, it would raise an exception error 100% of the time. So a user who's going to try to access this API endpoint needs to request this API endpoint with a JSON JSON object, which would contain the specific information we need, which is the amount of money that is charged in the transaction that the user conducted. For example, 4.2, 4.5, 4.7, whatever that may be. Then we save that JSON object as a data variable in our code base. Then in the amount variable, we convert that data variable into a float object so we can do mathematical calculations on that particular information we're getting through the JSON object. When we talk about JSON objects, a very important aspect to note here is that JSON objects are the standard method of communication between applications on the web. So whether a website is communicating with a server or a website is communicating with a API endpoint or any other application on the web that is communicating with each other, 90% of the time it would send and receive information in JSON. That's pretty much the standard on how web applications communicate with each other, with servers or API endpoints. So that is why, as a standard, we're going to use JSON. And that is also very important in developing RESTful APIs or RESTful applications on Flask. Now then we run the roundup logic, which is the recorded amount. We create a recorded amount variable that rounds the amount by adding 0.5 to it. So basically what it does is it rounds up towards whatever amount that we give the amount. So in all cases, the 0.5 would help us round up. And if it's 4.2, if a normal round function is used, it's going to round to 4. But with 0.5, we're going to always round it up to 5. And because that's what we need to do, and that's what these applications such as Acorns and similar applications do to run that rounding up feature for sense. Then we also need to identify the rounded up value. So that is the amount of money that we need to charge the basically this is the recorded amount that we calculate by rounding up is the amount we charge the bank account, and rounded up value is the difference between the charged amount and what the actual cost was to buy that product or that make that transaction through your card or your bank account basically. So that difference, that is the rounded amount. And why this difference is important, because that is the amount that we're going to save within our Acorns or any similar application for the user to invest basically, or do whatever they want with it. Now that we have run the rounding up logic and just got all the information we need, now we need to return the object again. We can simply return all these three amounts, but the standard for communication is a JSON file. So we use a Flask helper function called JSONify, which converts a normal a normal object into a JSON object. So here we're sending out all the three information, which is the original amount we got from the request, the rounded up value that we calculated here, and the rounded up amount that we calculated here, and the rounded up value that we calculated here. All three of these amounts are going to be sent back from our API endpoint to the requesting user. And along with that, we send them a 200 status code, which means everything went well and the API worked as it should.